Hi everyone. In this slide we'll be looking at a section of the esophagus. Now this one is a little unusual in that this section is not actually a cross section through the esophagus. It's actually a longitudinal section through the esophagus. And so right now it doesn't really look like there's any evidence of that, but when we go out to some of the outer layers of the esophagus, we're going to notice that the arrangement of muscle out here, for example, is a little unexpected. Okay, so let's talk about the organization of this organ. Okay, so what we're looking at right now, where the pointer is the lumen. Now around the inside of that lumen we have the epithelium. That's this here. This is a stratified squamous epithelium. We'll take a look at that in a moment in more detail. Beneath the epithelium is a layer of connective tissue. So from here to here is the lamina propria. Beneath that we see something a little bit more eosinophilic, and so what you're seeing is just fragments, what looks like fragments of eosinophilic material. What you're looking at here is the muscularis mucosa. Beyond this is the tunica submucosa, so more of a dense connective tissue layer, and what we're seeing in this region here are some glands. And so what you're seeing here are the submucosal glands of the esophagus. These glands produce the mucus, which will travel to the surface. So you can see one of these ducts leading up to the surface right here. Okay, and so that lubricates the surface of the esophagus so that when you're swallowing your food, it helps the food move along smoothly. Okay, so these are mucus glands, which is why they're very poorly stained. As you will see, basically these are glands filled with cells that look very much like goblet cells, and you will see that the glands have a fairly wide open lumen, so these are mucus glands. Now beyond the tunica submucosa, we have the tunica muscularis. Now this is where we understand that we're looking at a longitudinal section instead of a cross section, because this muscle here is actually seen in cross section, but this is in fact the inner layer of muscle, and this is the inner circular layer, which means that it goes around the circumference of the lumen. Okay, and so if this was a cross section through the esophagus, you would see a longitudinal section through muscle here, but what we're seeing instead is actually a cross section. And as we go further away, in this region here is a second layer of muscle. This is the outer longitudinal muscle, and what you're seeing here is actually somewhat longitudinal looking sections through muscle here. Okay, and that would be that outer longitudinal layer of muscle, so it's running along the length of the esophagus. Now beyond this muscle we have this kind of a connective tissue layer. There is no boundary out here, so this is the tunica adventitia. Okay, so basically the connective tissue layer out here merges with the connective tissue that surrounds other structures. Okay, so we're actually looking at the upper portion of the esophagus, and so again we know this because we're looking at tunica adventitia out in the outer region, but we also know that this is the upper portion of the esophagus because we know, or hopefully we can tell, that the muscle here is actually not smooth muscle but skeletal muscle, okay, or rather striated muscle. Okay, so what we're seeing here is striated muscle in cross section, and we see that in the upper portions of the esophagus where you still have the ability to swallow, and so a bit more control over this muscle. Okay. Now the interesting thing is that as we go along in the tunica adventitia here, the tunica adventitia ends, and that's a bit of dirt. I should have wiped this slide. But as we go along, you can start to see that the tunica adventitia becomes replaced by kind of a smooth surface on the outside. So what we're seeing here is a transition to a tunica serosa. And a tunica serosa is kind of a loose connective tissue outer layer with a simple squamous mesothelium around the outside. So that's what you're seeing out here is the tunica serosa. Whereas a little further up, this was the upper portion of the esophagus. We have the tunica adventitia, which kind of, again, connects the esophagus to other parts of the body, and that starts to end right around here where we start to see a tunica serosa show up. Okay, so we're getting closer towards the middle portion of the esophagus here. Again, the muscle in Tunica Muscularis is going to start to transition over. Right now it's still a skeletal muscle or striated muscle, but it will, as we go deeper, turn into a smooth muscle instead. Okay, so let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail now. Let's take a look at this at a higher magnification. So let's start with the epithelium. So we're going to go from, this is 100x, we're going to move to 400x magnification. And so again, what you're seeing here is that duct leading from one of the submucosal glands leading up to the surface. And again, at the surface, we can clearly see we have a stratified squamous epithelium. So if you look at the top, the surface layers, we have a squamous appearance to these cells, and we have multiple layers. So we're looking at a stratified squamous epithelium. Beneath that, we have some connective tissue. This is the lamina propria of the tunica mucosa. And as we go a little deeper here, we start to see some muscle. This is the muscularis mucosa, the more eosinophilic material. And then beyond that, we have some of those submucosal glands I mentioned earlier. Let me see if I can increase the contrast a little bit so we can see more of the boundaries of these cells. Unfortunately, we can't really, the staining is not very good. You can kind of make it out if you know what you're looking for, that there is a lumen here, and the cells are just filled with these small granules of mucus wherever you look. Okay, this is a submucosal gland. And again, the rest of the submucosa here. And as we go further, we start to see the muscle layer in the tunica muscularis. And again, we have a kind of an oblique section here, so it's not ideal. But we can kind of make out the fact that we have peripheral nuclei. Again, I think this was a little bit more obvious from the lower magnification, where you can kind of see the outlines of these cells a little bit better. But you can see that the nuclei are all peripheral here, and the cells themselves are filled completely with this eosinophilic material. So we're now looking at skeletal or striated muscle. Again, this is a cross section through it, and here's more of a longitudinal section through it over here. Again, the layers seem to be reversed, and that's because we're looking at a longitudinal section through the esophagus instead of a cross section through the esophagus. And again, as we go beyond the tunica muscularis, we get into the tunica adventitia, more connective tissue, some blood vessels, and so on. Again, there's no clear boundary here. But as we go further, a little bit deeper in, we start to see a change. So we have a tunica adventitia out here, but then we move over here, and we start to see a clear boundary at the edge of this organ, and we have some simple squamous cells, a simple squamous mesothelium here. So what we're looking at here, this layer from here to here would be the tunica serosa. Okay, we'll see you in the next video.